This is the story of Richard Ellison Hartwell and his wife Victoria Ann Hartwell. They had been married for 14 years when the cracks that had always existed in their foundation finally let the water in. Victoria had built her sense of security not on love exactly, but on the reliable architecture of their life together, the house in Westport, the dinner parties, the shared silences that she had long ago mistaken for contentment. Richard was not a cruel man. That was the difficult part. He was charming, professionally accomplished, and capable of warmth in precisely the doses that kept people from asking for more. What neither of them had examined, not truly, was the growing distance between who they were to each other and who they needed to be. This is a story about what happens when two people stop choosing each other without ever deciding to stop. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and burnt butter on the Tuesday that nothing important happened. Victoria was standing at the stove, correcting the heat under a pan of chicken thighs, when Richard came in through the back door with his briefcase still in hand and his tie loosened in that way he had not undone, just gestured at, like a concession he hadn't fully committed to. He set the briefcase down on the chair by the mudroom instead of the hook, and she noticed without saying anything. "Long one?" she asked. Board meeting ran over. He opened the refrigerator, stood in front of it for a moment the way people do when they're not actually hungry. "Smells good. It's the same thing I made last week." "I know. I like it." They ate at the kitchen island rather than the dining table, which was something that had shifted gradually over the years. What once felt casual now felt like avoidance of the formality their marriage no longer required. Victoria had a glass of white wine. Richard had water. She noticed that too. Their daughter, Meg, was at her father's in Connecticut, Victoria's first marriage, the one she never talked about in detail, so the house had the particular quality of quietness that large houses get when the people inside them are being careful. Not careful with each other exactly, just careful. "Marcus called," Victoria said. "He wants to know if we're still doing the 4th of July thing." "What did you tell him?" "That I'd check with you." Richard looked up. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 2 seconds longer than it needed to. "Sure. Tell him yes." She refilled her wine. He watched her do it in the way that people watch things they've decided not to comment on. After dinner, he went to his study to answer emails, and she sat in the living room with a novel she had been reading for 6 weeks and hadn't gotten past page 90. She wasn't a slow reader. She simply kept starting the same chapter over, and she wasn't entirely sure why. The study light was visible under the door for a long time. They had met at a fundraiser for a children's hospital in New Haven, which was the kind of origin story that sounds clean and civic-minded from the outside. Victoria had been 31, newly divorced, trying on a version of herself that felt more deliberate than the one she'd worn through her 20s. Richard had been 36, recently made partner at his firm, wearing confidence in the easy way of men who have been told since boyhood that they are exceptional. He had asked her opinion about a painting on the wall, something abstract and overpriced, and she had said she thought it looked like someone had sneezed on a canvas, and he had laughed with his whole chest. She had thought, this is a man who can be surprised. That turned out to be true, and also, in ways she would understand only later, the source of most of their trouble. They were not unhappy. That distinction mattered to Victoria, especially now, especially in retrospect. Unhappy was a word with weight and direction. What they were was something flatter, frequency. She had no good word for. They were present with each other without being attentive. They were kind without being curious. Richard remembered her coffee order and forgot the name of the book she'd mentioned 3 times. She knew exactly how he took his scotch and had stopped asking how he felt about anything that wasn't logistical. 14 years of that can look, from the outside, like a very successful marriage. She knew that. She had looked at it from the outside herself. Sometimes at dinner parties, watching Richard hold a room, watching him turn toward her occasionally with the warmth of a man performing warmth for an audience. She would catch it briefly, like something peripheral. And then the moment would pass, and she would refill someone's glass and laugh at the right time and think, this is fine. Most people don't even have this. The night before everything began to shift, they lay in bed reading her novel. his New Yorker, and he reached over without looking up from the page and found her hand and held it for a few minutes before letting go. She lay there afterward, staring at the ceiling, trying to decide if that had been affection or habit. She never quite resolved it. Laura Voss was 28 and worked in marketing, which meant she was good at knowing what something looked like before deciding what it was. She had started at Hartwell and Crane 8 months ago, and within 3 months, she was having dinner with Richard at a restaurant in the city that was not the kind of place you took someone you worked with. She knew that. She had walked in knowing it, in fact, which was part of what made it feel significant rather than cautionary. She was not naive. She had simply decided that the rules applied to people who wanted different things than she did. She told Caleb about it on a Thursday over coffee, which was perhaps not her most considered decision, but Caleb had a way of making her want to prove things. They had been together for 2 years before she ended it, or before it ended, depending on how you told it, and now they had the particular intimacy of people who have stopped dating but haven't stopped mattering to each other. "He's a senior partner," she said. Caleb held his cup with both hands, at his own firm. "Yes." He looked at her the way he always looked at her when he was deciding whether to say the thing he was thinking. "How married is he? What does that mean?" "It means some people are married the way you're employed somewhere, and some people are married like it's load-bearing." She looked out the window. A woman was trying to collapse a stroller on the sidewalk while a toddler sat on the pavement next to her, apparently unbothered. "I don't think it's load-bearing." Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. "Then, you seem happy." "I am." "Okay." She recognized that okay. It was the one that meant, "I think you're wrong, but I've decided you need to find out yourself." What Laura felt with Richard was difficult to reduce cleanly to attraction, though attraction was part of it. What she felt was more like visibility. Richard asked questions and then waited for the full answer. He remembered what she said from one conversation to the next. He treated her opinions about marketing strategy with the same seriousness he brought to boardroom discussions. And there was something in that, something she had been hungry for without knowing it was food. She was not unaware that some of this was performance. She was in marketing after all. But even performed attention can meet a real need, and she had real needs that Caleb, for all his steadiness, had never quite located. Victoria noticed the change in Richard, the way you notice the season turning gradually, then all at once, then you can't remember a time before it. He was more careful with his phone, not secretive in the obvious, clumsy way of someone hiding something, just careful. Present with it in a way he hadn't been before. He also started coming home slightly later, which was within the plausible range of a man who billed his hours and whose clients called from different time zones. It was a perfectly defensible lateness. She wasn't sure if she was suspicious or just paying attention in a way she hadn't been for a long time. One evening, she sat across from him at the kitchen island and watched him check something on his phone and smile a small, private smile, quickly assembled and quickly put away, and she felt something she couldn't immediately name, not quite hurt. Something quieter, the sense of a door closing in a room she hadn't known she wanted to enter. She said nothing. He looked up. "What?" "Nothing. Just thinking." He nodded and went back to his phone. There was a conversation they had in late October that she thought about often afterward. They were in the car coming back from Marcus and Elena's anniversary dinner, and the road was dark and wet, and the particular intimacy of a car at night had loosened something in her. "Do you think we're happy?" she asked. He kept his eyes on the road. "What brought that on?" "Marcus made a toast. He said the secret was never letting the other person feel like an afterthought." "That's a good toast." "Richard, I think we're—" He paused. "I think we have a good life." "That's not the same thing." "No," he said. "It isn't." The rain came down. The wipers moved. She looked out at the wet road and thought about saying more, and then didn't, and then? She glanced into the middle distance, the way people do in old films when they're about to say something they know doesn't belong in the scene. Her voice changed slightly, became aware of itself. "I don't know. Maybe someone watching this should, like this story, or subscribe or something." Richard looked at her, briefly confused, then slightly alarmed. What? She blinked, turned back to the window. Nothing. I don't know why I said that. He let it go. The wipers kept moving. They drove the rest of the way in silence, and neither of them mentioned it again. That night, Victoria lay awake and made herself say the thing she had been rehearsing. She thought, my husband is not quite here. He is somewhere else when he is with me, and I think I know where he is. And I think I have been allowing this because I was not sure I had the right to want more than what we agreed to become. Then she thought, that is a very gentle way of saying I am frightened. She slept badly and woke up resolved, in the vague and preliminary way of resolutions that haven't found their form yet. Laura suggested the dinner. She would think about that later, that it was her idea, that she had arranged the place and the time and sat across from Richard in a restaurant they'd been to twice before. And she had been the one who said, finally, that she needed to understand what they were doing. I'm not asking for a declaration, she said. I just need to know if this is real or if it's... She looked for the word. Provisional. Richard set down his fork. He had the quality of stillness that powerful men develop, where they can make a room feel like it's waiting for them. Laura, don't Laura me like I'm a situation to be managed. I'm not. Then answer the question. He was quiet for a moment. Across the restaurant, a table of 4 were laughing at something, and the sound felt very far away. What's happening between us is real, he said. What I can offer you right now is... He stopped. Laura looked up and saw in his expression, not guilt exactly, but something recalibrating. And then she heard a voice behind her. Richard. It was not a loud entrance. That was the thing she remembered later. Victoria Hartwell walked across the restaurant the way she walked across most spaces, with the practiced composure of a woman who had learned, early, that visible emotion was a cost she couldn't afford. She was in her coat. She had a leather folder under her arm. She didn't look at Laura the way Laura had braced for with rage or tears, or the theater of a wronged woman. She looked at her with something more unsettling, a kind of exhausted recognition, as if she were seeing the 3rd or 4th version of something she had already made peace with understanding. She sat down, not across from Richard, in the chair to his left, as if she were joining a meeting. I wasn't going to come, she said, but my attorney thought it would be efficient. She set the leather folder on the table. These are the preliminary separation documents. I'd like you to have your attorney look at them by Friday. Richard's face was entirely still. Victoria. There's no version of this conversation I haven't already had in my head, she said. Please don't make me have it out loud. Laura sat very still. She had the sensation of having walked into a building and found that the floor was on a different level than she'd expected. Not a fall exactly, but a stumble, a sudden recalibration of where the ground was. I should go, she said. Victoria looked at her, then really looked at her for the first time. You don't have to. This is a restaurant. A pause. But I'm going to need a few minutes with my husband. The way she said husband was not weaponized. It was factual and tired, and somehow that was worse. Laura gathered her coat and her bag and walked out into the November night, and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment before she understood that she was shaking, not from cold. She stood there and thought about what Caleb had said. Load-bearing. She had been so certain she'd assessed this correctly. Inside, Richard and Victoria sat across from each other at the table with the folder between them, and Victoria said quietly, I want you to know I'm not angry at you. I don't believe you. No, she said. I mean it. I'm angry at myself. She looked at her hands, for deciding that this was enough. For long enough that you believed me. Victoria, I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm not even asking you to explain. She touched the folder. I just needed you to know that I saw it, that I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She paused. That's all. He didn't say anything for a long time. Outside, the city continued its indifferent work. I didn't mean for it to be like this, he finally said. I know, that probably doesn't help. No, she said, but it's good to know you know. She stood and buttoned her coat. She did not cry. She had decided, some weeks ago, that she would not do that here. She left the folder on the table and walked out, and the restaurant absorbed her exit without ceremony. The months after have a particular texture that Laura didn't expect. She had imagined, dimly, that if things unraveled, they would unravel toward her, that there would be a conversation, an ultimatum, a choice Richard would make. What she hadn't mapped was the possibility that the unraveling would simply occur around her like weather, and that when it settled, she would find herself not at the center of anything, but at the margin of a story that had been ongoing long before she arrived. Richard did not choose Laura. He also, technically, did not choose against her. It was more that the situation redistributed itself according to forces she hadn't understood she was part of. He took a leave of absence from the firm in January. She transferred to a different department, and they stopped having dinner, and then they stopped having coffee, and then they stopped. It happened quietly. That was the part that bothered her. She had expected the ending to have more weight. It had the weight of something that was never quite fully real, which was a different kind of hurt than she'd prepared for. She called Caleb in February. Not to say you were right, she wasn't ready for that, and he was too decent to want it. She called because she needed to hear a voice that knew her before all this. I think I confused being seen with being chosen, she said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I think there's a difference. I know that now. For what it's worth, I think he did see you, Caleb said. I don't think that was fake. It doesn't change anything. No, but it's not nothing either. She appreciated that. She held it somewhere careful. Victoria moved into the apartment in Darien that had been her mother's before her mother moved to Florida, and she found, to her surprise, that she did not hate it. She had expected grief with teeth. What she got was something more like quiet, the specific quiet of a woman who has spent years listening for something and finally stopped. She had a standing dinner with Elena on Thursdays, and she returned to the watercolor class she had abandoned in 2019. And she had 2 difficult conversations with Meg that she handled better than she expected. She was not thriving exactly, but she was more honest than she'd been in years. She didn't talk about Richard at dinner parties. When people asked how she was doing, she said managing well, thank you, which was true in the technical sense and easier than the full answer. The full answer was, I think I knew for a long time. I think I chose not to look. I think I was complicit in my own erasure, and I'm still deciding what to do with that. She sat with that. She didn't share it yet. Maybe not ever with some people, but she stopped pretending it wasn't there. Richard, for his part, did not emerge from the year as anything as simple as a man who had learned his lesson. He was more honest with himself than that. He knew what he had been doing, not only with Laura, but for years before, with the particular self-serving kindness of a man who mistakes the absence of cruelty for the presence of love. He had given Victoria comfort and safety and the appearance of partnership. He had not given her his full attention, his curiosity, his willingness to be changed by her. He sat with a therapist on Wednesday, something he would not have done 2 years ago, and he spent a lot of time on the question of what he'd been afraid of. Not of Victoria. Of being known. Of letting someone close enough to measure the distance between who he performed being and who he actually was. He was not certain he had changed. He was certain he was trying. He did not know if that was enough. He had stopped pretending he knew. They met for coffee in April, Victoria and Richard, because there was paperwork to finalize and because they had agreed, in the early and more difficult weeks, that they would not end 14 years without at least one conversation that wasn't routed through attorneys. The place was a cafe in downtown Westport, the kind of neighborhood they had both moved through hundreds of times. The kind of ordinary place that becomes strange when you are occupying it differently than you used to. Victoria was there first. She had her coat on the chair beside her and was looking at her phone when he came in. And she looked up and watched him cross the room toward her, this man she had organized her life around for 14 years, and felt something that was neither love nor its opposite, something that had gone too far in both directions to find a simple name. He sat down. They ordered coffee. You look well, he said. I'm okay. She considered. Better than I expected. He nodded. He looked at the table, then at her, and she could see him assembling something, some version of what he wanted to say. And she waited. I've been trying to figure out how to say I'm sorry in a way that doesn't ask anything of you, he said. And I can't find it, so I'll just say it and you can do whatever you want with it. Okay, I'm sorry for what I did, and for what I did with, which was. He stopped. More. For a long time. Victoria held her cup. I know, that's all. Okay. He looked at her. She looked back. The cafe moved around them, an espresso machine, a chair scraping, two women at the corner table laughing about something. I used to think, Victoria said slowly, that being unhappy would have been easier, because then I'd have known. It would have been clear. She looked at the window. But we weren't. We were just, she searched, beside each other for years. Comfortable and beside each other, and I thought that was the point. I thought so too, Richard said. I know. That's the part I keep coming back to. She met his eyes. You weren't lying to me. You were lying to yourself. And I was letting you, because I was doing the same thing. That's generous. It's not generous. It's just accurate. She picked up her coffee. I'm not trying to distribute blame evenly. What you did was wrong, but I was there too. I knew something was wrong years before I named it, and I chose quiet, over and over. Richard was quiet for a moment. Where does that leave us? Divorced. She said it without bitterness. And honest, maybe, about what it actually was. He sat with that. Outside, a woman walked past the window with a dog on a leash, the dog stopping to investigate something in the planter near the door, the woman waiting with the patient resignation of someone who has learned what cannot be hurried. I think I loved you, Richard said. I want to say that. I'm not using it as I'm just saying it as a true thing. I know. Victoria looked at him carefully. I think you loved the version of me that didn't need anything you weren't giving. She let that settle. That's not a criticism. It's just maybe more accurate. He didn't argue. He couldn't. They finished their coffee. She signed the pages he had brought. He slid them into the folder and the folder into his bag, and then they sat for a moment with nothing left to do. Take care of yourself, she said. You too. She stood, put on her coat. He stood too, and for a moment they stood across the small table from each other, the way people stand when they are deciding whether to embrace. And then she gave him a small nod, and he returned it, and she walked to the door. He watched her go, not with longing exactly, not with regret exactly, with a particular ache of a man seeing clearly something he had looked at for years without quite seeing her capability, her restraint, the careful way she held herself when she walked into a room, all that quiet strength she had spent on them, on him, on a version of their life that had never quite managed to deserve it. The door closed behind her. He sat back down, held his empty cup. Outside, the April light was doing something generous with the street, the way spring light does, making the ordinary look, briefly, like it means something. He sat there for a while. He didn't know what he was waiting for. He had the sense, sitting there, that he was at the beginning of something he didn't have a name for, yet not redemption, because that felt too clean, and not grief, because he had moved through most of the acute part, something quieter. The work of living inside the truth of what you have done and choosing still to keep going. He left eventually, tipped well, walked out into the pale spring afternoon. Down the block, Victoria was already gone. Laura, in a different part of the city, was having lunch with Caleb. Just lunch, no agenda. The way people sometimes find their way back to each other's ordinary company after the harder things have passed. She would not talk about Richard. She would talk about her new role and the apartment she was thinking of leaving and a novel she'd been meaning to read. She would order the soup and look out the window at the street and feel, for the first time in months, like herself. Not a smaller version, not a cautionary figure in someone else's story. Just herself, mid-sentence, in an ordinary afternoon. It would feel, for a moment, like enough.